Hi everyone, welcome to the Energeia Podcast. This is Dr. G, and today I'm joined by Geher. Glenn is Professor of Psychology at the State University of New York at NEEPS, where he is also the founding director of Evolutionary Studies. Glenn has taught several courses at the undergraduate and graduate levels, including statistics, social psychology, and evolutionary psychology, and has won the NEEPS Alumni Association's Distinguished Teacher of the Year Award, along with Chancellor's Awards for both teaching and research excellence from the State University of New York. His research generally focuses on how evolution can shed light on issues of human behavior and the human experience, and has endeavored to integrate evolution into the behavioral sciences more broadly. His scholarly work has appeared in outlets such as the Journal of Psychology, Current Psychology, the Journal of Social Psychology, Psychological Reports, and Personality and Individual Differences, and has authored, co-authored, or contributed to several books and textbooks, including most recently writing the popular audience book, Positive Evolutionary Psychology, Darwin's Guide to Living a Richer Life, and publishing the popular Psychology Today blog, Darwin's Subterranean World, Evolution, Mind, and Mating Intelligence. Glenn has appeared in such media venues as BBC World Radio, CBS Sunday Morning, Al Jazeera, The Huffington Post, and NPR, and has also appeared in print and digital media such as Scientific American Mind, Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Ed, Nature, The New York Times, Times Higher Education, The London Times, The Washington Post, and The Atlantic, as well as Yahoo News, Al, Redbook, Cosmopolitan, and Men's Health. So Glenn, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me on the Energeia Podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me, Gareth. Glad to be here.
It's totally great to have you here. And today we're mostly going to cover themes from your 2019 book, Positive Evolutionary Psychology, Darwin's Guide to Living a Richer Life. But before we get to that, would you share with our listeners a little bit about your academic professional background and just the general path that took you to winding up working as Professor of Psychology at NEEPS, doing the research and teaching and all the other initiatives you're involved in, publishing books, organizing conferences, running a lab, all the other myriad of things you seem to be involved with, and perhaps what some of the greatest highlights along the way have been for you with regard to what you've come to learn about the field of psychology and the human mind more generally.
Sure. Yeah. Glad to speak to that. So when I was an undergraduate student, I guess I'll bring it back to 1988. Like most want-to-be psychology majors, I was 18 years old. I went to the University of Connecticut, and I erroneously assumed that the term psychology or psychologist and therapist were one and the same. And I had no idea about the behavioral science component of psychology. So I was in for a big shock when my professor, Gwen Gustafson at the University of Connecticut, started putting up stuff about the chemical nature of neural transmission and statistical formulas. And, I was scratching my head at the first couple of weeks. Then I eventually was like, wow, this stuff's actually really cool. And by the end of that semester, I became fascinated by understanding human behavior from a scientific perspective. So I'll fast forward a little bit. As I advanced in my undergraduate education, I ran into a course simply titled Animal Behavior, which was taught by a guy named Ben Sachs, super well-respected, very understated, but very prolific in his own right. One of the world's leading experts on erections in rats, by the way. So kind of an interesting content area. And unlike any other class I had, that particular class had this amazing thing where he taught us on the first day about some of the basics of evolution and evolutionary principles, which I'd never really been exposed to beyond whatever I took in biology, which never really sunk in very much at that point. And it was amazing to me because he started talking about a broad suite of kinds of animals. I remember learning things about various bird species, non-human primates, rats, felines. I remember him talking about chickens, frogs, fishes. And what was absolutely fascinating was that there was a single framework, like a single set of ideas that you literally could put down in like 2 or 3 paragraphs that were used to explicate the entirety of the course. So if he was talking about mating calls and coqui frogs in Puerto Rico, or if he was talking about the nature of pecking orders in chickens, like completely disparate seeming phenomena, completely disparate seeming organisms, and it all made sense within a single framework, which is essentially Darwin's big idea that life evolved via natural selection such that organisms that are around now are descendants of ancestors that were well adapted to their ancestral environments, that had a whole bunch of physical and behavioral qualities that helped to facilitate survival and reproductive success. And based on that, a working hypothesis, whenever you learn about a behavior or behavioral pattern, especially one that's very species typical or very common, a good start, not always the answer, but a good start is to ask the question of whether we can understand it as an evolved adaptation. And that was a mind blow to me. Like the fact that this kind older man who was very understated was able to just like come in day after day and just make me see and understand the nature of life in a way that was completely beyond what I'd ever known before, thought about before, or expected was absolutely fascinating. So I did some research in his lab as an undergraduate, which I do recommend for any undergraduate student. If you're really into psychology, knock on the door of your favorite professor and say, I'd love to do research with you. What can I do to help you make knowledge, learn new things in the behavioral sciences? It was such a great experience for me. So from there, I got gung-ho into it. I was very fortunate to get into the PhD program in psychology at the University of New Hampshire, which at the time was the only PhD psychology program in the United States that had a teaching component. So there's actually, in the third year of the 5-year program, you taught introductory psychology to undergraduates. You took an internship or a practicum in the teaching process that was a full year long, with multiple seasoned expert teachers who thought very much about pedagogy, and which is a fancy term for teaching and learning. And I loved it. I absolutely loved teaching, and I loved research related to the behavioral sciences. And it definitely was a good match for my interests, and it got me excited. And I think I was reasonably good at getting students excited about the content. And from there, I bounced around a little bit. I was in Oregon for a little bit. I was in Maine for a little bit, and I landed here in the Hudson Valley of New York, which is about an hour north of New York City. It's really a very picturesque place, right, with the Hudson River sort of, booming through the valley that's filled with mountains and apple orchards. Really just a beautiful, beautiful place. And I'm at the State University of New York at New Paltz. And I have been here since 2000, so almost a quarter of a century, which makes me feel really old when I put it that way. And I just quickly, some of the things that I do to speak to your question is I oversee the New Paltz Evolutionary Psychology Lab, and that's a team of graduate students, undergraduate students, and visiting scholars. We have about 10 to 15 members of the team going at any given time, and we're always doing research on various projects, trying to understand human behavior, some aspect of human behavior from an evolutionary perspective. So how can we understand, for instance, how people understand large-scale politics from an evolutionary perspective? So that's one study that we did. We recently just published something on ghosting. How can we understand why people ghost each other and what are the adverse effects? And how can we use an evolutionary framework to understand the psychology of ghosting? We just yesterday had something come out in the Oxford Handbook of Infidelity, which is why is infidelity so stressful and something that leads to such major societal problems? And if it's so stressful and problematic, why does it still exist? And what are the different kinds of infidelity, and how can we use evolution to understand that question? So this is just a sampling. Ever since I got bitten by the evolution bug back in literally my undergraduate days, I've never stopped thinking of humans as animals evolved via natural selection, and our behavior is an extension of that. And it's just a really fascinating way to understand what it means to be human. So as along the way, I got so into this that at some point I worked with a group of students here, and I said, what if we put out a very bold idea, and came up with the idea of a regional psychology conference in evolutionary psychology. And part of this was motivated, and you'll see this is a little bit of a theme in my own work. Part of this was motivated by the fact that I came to find, surprisingly at first, that not everyone loves evolutionary psychology. And some people very aggressively hate evolutionary psychology. And I was, what? I was like, what? This makes no sense. Evolutionary psychology is so powerful. It leads to such important insights. It's so interesting. It's very rare that you get a student looking bored in class when you're talking about this stuff. It has so much in the way of implications for understanding who we are. So, long story short, I kind of felt a little bit intellectually alone, like, very closely connected with people on campus, lots of good connections and friends, in a personal level, but in an intellectual level, it was like, oh, that's the guy that does that stuff that we all hate. It was a real short version of what it's like to be an evolutionary psychologist in a traditional psychology department. But I wasn't to be discouraged. I loved living here. Had two kids. My family sort of expanded here, and it was just a beautiful place to live. And I love the university, and I love the students. So I decided with some of my students, I said, let's make our own society. Let's make something that we ended up calling the Northeastern Evolutionary Psychology Society. Reached out to several critical people early on from some other schools. Rose Sokol Chang was one person that we reached out to. She was a fresh PhD at the time, and she and Sarah Strout I reached out to also. They started a brand new journal, it was called the Journal of Social, Evolutionary, and Cultural Psychology, which is now Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences, the only APA journal on the topic of evolutionary psychology. Reached out to them, reached out to Dan Kruger at the University of Michigan, and just kind of started with a small group, reached out to Becky Birch, who's at Oswego, and just we had this idea of a small conference of maybe 20, 30 people that would be, mostly from New York, New England, maybe Pennsylvania kind of thing. And the first conference we had, which was on our campus in 2007, we drew people from multiple continents, multiple provinces in Canada. Several people came from California. I'm like, that's not Northeast, that's kind of Southwest. And it was of all the ideas that I've had, this one nailed it. I've got to say, I could easily give a whole hour-long discussion about bad ideas I've had, but let's focus on this one particular idea, which I was amazed. I couldn't believe. I was like, this really took off, and we were endorsed by people like David Buss, who was at the time the president of the Human Behavior and Evolution Society, an international society on this topic, probably the leading figure in the field for years now. We ended up having our own journal published again, like I was saying, by the APA. And I know that I've gotten to meet yourself at that conference and lots of other great young aspiring evolutionary behavioral scientists. And I learned so much, and my students who go to these conferences get so much out of it. And there's a lot of positive feedback that we get. We tend to get feedback that the conference is intellectually rigorous, while at the same time being friendly, being student friendly, and having just a fun sort of positive vibe to it. And we're now going into, with the pandemic, it's a little funky to count, but I think about our 16th or 17th annual conference, which will be held in April, by the way, here right on our own campus at New Paltz. It'll be the fifth time we'll host it here, and we cannot wait. So that's a short version of kind of how I got to where I am now, and hopefully that's of
It's
interest.
extremely of interest and all very, very useful background context. As you mentioned, I was fortunate enough to get to go to two of the NEEPS conferences. Actually, the one at I don't know if it was the most recent one at New Paltz. I think it was 2018 or 19, but it is a beautiful little town, and it was actually a really. I recall I had to fly from Cleveland to Philadelphia, then Philadelphia to Poughkeepsie, and then get an Uber or something like that to get there. So it was a little bit of a winding voyage to actually get there. But when I got there, beautiful little spot, beautiful Airbnb. I had nothing but fond memories of that trip. And we're going to return to, I think, a couple of these leitmotifs throughout our conversation, namely the first you mentioned about what we can learn about animal behavior to make inferences about our own psychology, and also the still sort of persistent antipathy we see towards evolutionary psychology among a lot of scholars. I think we'll sort of get to those two motifs kind of along the way. But I think without further ado, let's dive on into the thrust of today's conversation, and specifically starting things off with positive psychology and what you are trying to add or have tried to add to this conversation. So positive psychology has become this kind of boom times movement in psychology in the last few decades. It's kind of morphed from being this more hopeful and optimistic framing of psychology in general that Marty Seligman, originally called for, into a kind of fully fledged subdiscipline in its own right. And then it's sort of morphed again through to this now pervasive almost movement that's filtered into not just the mind sciences, but into business and education and other areas as well. And your book opens up with this particular framing of both positive psychology and evolutionary psychology as subdisciplines that are kind of almost orbiting each other at a distance within psychology at large, sort of contributing to the overall canon in their own way without ever dialoguing across their subdisciplinary silos and without ever having been brought to bear upon each other very much, which to me was the most exciting thing about this book when I first heard about it from you, because the non-integration of these two branches always struck me as such a glaring oversight to begin with. So it's such an important niche that I think you were trying to fill. So when you were, I guess my first question would be, when you were first conceiving of this book with your co-author, Nicole Wedberg, what was your initial inspiration or collective thought process like in terms of what you perceive to be what was missing from orthodox positive psychology, such that an evolutionary psychological perspective could contribute something of additional theoretical or empirical or practical substance? And perhaps going the other way, also what was missing from evolutionary psychology, such that a more mainstream positive psychological perspective was value for that subdiscipline. So what was not already there in your own mind, in the scholarly conversation and in the popular understanding of both subdisciplines, that led to this idea of positive evolutionary psychology as a way of fully integrating the two together and leveraging the best of both worlds?
Sure, that's a very, very well articulated question, Gareth. And I will start by saying that it was a culmination. It definitely was a culmination. It kind of relates to what I was saying in my prior answer regarding why we developed NEEPS. NEEPS, the Northeastern Evolutionary Psych Society, came about partly because scholars in this field weren't really feeling super connected intellectually in their home departments, but as a group, as a team, we are strongly connected intellectually, and it was a great way to sort of advance the goals of evolutionary psychology. In the same breath, part of the reason that we started NEEPS also had to do with what I'll call the PR problem, or the public relations problem of evolutionary psychology. When you hear, and this is a broad stroke generalization, but when you hear intellectuals outside of evolutionary psychology talk about the field, there's some famous misunderstandings, famous mischaracterizations. People tend to think this is a field that is about creating a super species. That's one thing that I hear. People tend to think that this is a field that is about genetic determinism and what genes make people what do specific things, which is not at all what the field is about. Some people have this idea that the field is almost eugenicist. I've heard this criticism, which is like, this is a field that's out to sort of figure out what people should reproduce and shouldn't reproduce. And like, there's a lot of ick. I can't just to use a simple three letter word. There's a lot of ick. And one of the things that I've tried to do in my career is sort of break down some of these mischaracterizations and sort of give a more full and genuine and accurate take on what the field is. And at some point, I started thinking about positive psychology. I once heard Martin Seligman speak at an APA conference. I heard about his famous speech that he gave, his presidential address, and I believe it was the year 2000. Maybe it was 1990. Gosh, time goes fast. But he gave this famous presidential speech that you alluded to before, where he called for behavioral scientists to focus on not the problems of human psychology, which, there's plenty of and a lot of research on that, but what are the things that lead people to thrive? And what are the things that lead people and communities to thrive? And why don't we scientifically study what's positive? And it occurred to me in just sort of being in psychology, getting snippets of positive psychology here and there, I always liked the idea. It's one of these how could you not like the idea kinds of things. So I always liked the idea, but I always found myself saying, these people could really benefit from understanding evolutionary psychology and integrating that into their work. So with this kind of in the back burner of my mind, I was with Nicole Wedberg, who was an amazing graduate student at the time. And I said to her, I'm interested in potentially writing a book, and you're a great writer and a great student. I would love if you could co-author this with me. And she, was happy to take that opportunity. And I feel very fortunate for that. And as a kickoff to thinking about this, we went to a small symposium that was actually on campus on the topic of positive psychology. And we came there with our notebooks, and it was a poster session. So there were about maybe 30 posters. And a poster, for people who don't know, a poster session means that it's someone puts up like a 4-foot by 3-foot poster with their research ideas and findings up on a board. And then you meet with people for about 2 or 3 minutes, sometimes if it's more of more interest or there's more to say. You learn about their findings, and it's a good way to get a lot of research in a small amount of time. So you hop from one poster to the next. And I will say it was the research was reasonably high quality. I don't want to criticize the research, but I will say that there was a real glaring issue that, to me, Nicole, necessitated or at least warranted our book. And what the problem, and it's an ironic problem, the problem was that every single presentation dealt with happiness. And every single one was, does this manipulation lead to more happiness than people in some other condition? Or does this experience increase happiness levels? Or does this? And I remember asking all the presenters, and it was part of, we were trying to develop our ideas for this book. So I asked all the presenters very genuinely, have you learned about evolutionary principles, and have you thought about how they relate to what you're studying? And the answer was an absolute goose egg, 0. And, and what we concluded, and then we did a more thorough, systematic review of literature in the field of positive psychology, and you just don't see connections. You don't see citations to evolutionary psychologists. You don't see connections with these ideas. The reason happiness is a problem, and I feel a little bit weird saying that, but the reason happiness is a problem is that it's excessively limited to think that this singular goal of being a human should be happiness. Because if happiness were the only goal, then people should quit their jobs, and people who go to the gym should stop going to the gym because that's a hassle and that's uncomfortable. And today it was rainy here in the Hudson Valley, so maybe I should have called in sick because that's a hassle to go out in the cold rain. It makes me unhappy to be, happiness is good. I'm not against happiness, but from an evolutionary perspective, happiness fits into a much bigger framework. And it fits into a framework of understanding the emotions writ large, all of the emotions from an evolutionary perspective. In 1872, Charles Darwin published the book, The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals. And he was really, I like to think, the very first evolutionary psychologist who was really interested in understanding emotions from an evolutionary perspective. What is the function of emotions? Why did we evolve these emotions? How do they ultimately help individuals survive and or reproduce? From that perspective, we can think of happiness from an adaptationist perspective. So what is happiness? Well, it follows from when we do things that would have increased survival and reproductive probabilities under ancestral conditions. Finding good food increases happiness. Finding shelter increases happiness. Doing well in some kind of work-related context, doing well in a social context, being invited to like the cool kids party. These are things that not only make people feel happy, but they also would have had ancestral benefits in terms of survival and reproduction. Finding a mate, falling in love, having someone love you back. These are all things that lead to happiness, but they lead to happiness because our ancestors who experienced those would have done whatever actions they did, they would have been reinforced for doing, because if I do this and then it leads to advances in my social status or social standing, then maybe I'll do it again. And then happiness exists because it rewards behaviors that would have led to survival and reproductive success in our ancestors. That said, happiness is what we would call a proximate goal. So under ancestral conditions, it made sense to be happy when those kinds of things would have come about. But it also made sense to be angry under certain conditions. When someone cheated you out of something, if people didn't get that emotion of anger and they said, oh, you took all my stuff, you took all my food, you took my family, you took my romantic partner, that's fine. I'm still happy. That would not have been good. Experiencing anger under those conditions and expressing it in some way would have had adaptive benefits. If there's a predator in the vicinity, if there's a poisonous snake that shows up, showing happiness then would probably be a really bad idea. I'm a runner, and I was recently running in the mountains here in New Paltz, and I kid you not, there are 3 poisonous snakes here in the Hudson Valley, and one of them is the timber rattler snake, and it was either that or a copperhead. They look very similar, but it was right. I was being so stupid. I was looking at my phone when I was running, which is a terrible idea. And I literally stepped on a poisonous snake, and I couldn't believe that it didn't bite me. I looked down. I was like, oh my God, that's like a copperhead right there. And it just slithered away. And I was frightened, deeply frightened out of my head. And why would I be happy in that situation? That fear is going to make it so maybe next time I'm running in that same area, maybe I won't be on my phone, so maybe fear facilitates behaviors that increase survival and reproductive success and helps us avoid threatening stimuli. Anger has a place, sadness has a place, anxiety certainly has a place. One quick anecdote that I think puts a face to all this, which was given by Randy Nesse, who coined the terms Darwinian medicine and Darwinian psychiatry. Brilliant, highly renowned scholar. And he has this great anecdote that he writes about and talks about, where he says, early on, as a professor at the University of Michigan, He was also a psychiatrist and had an office on the side, had a practice on the side. And he had another professor from a different department come to him for help. And the problem was anxiety, which is unfortunately very common. And so, being a psychiatrist who was young at the time, and he did what psychiatrists do and said, well, here's the best pills for anxiety and come back in 3 weeks. So the guy came back in 3 weeks, and Randy said to him, so how you doing? He said, well, it kind of depends what you mean. He said, I'm not feeling anxious these days, but I have this giant stack of papers on my desk and I have no motivation to grade these whatsoever, which was one of the things that got Randy Nesse, who's very, very big in the field of understanding emotions from an evolutionary perspective. It got him thinking, happiness isn't really the answer. We've evolved to have this entire suite of emotional experiences, with all the different emotional experiences having their own little role and their own little function. And that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. So it was that experience early on, and a cluster of experiences like that led him to really develop these fields of Darwinian medicine and starting to understand human health, mental health and physical health, from an evolutionary perspective. And it occurred to me that this is what positive psychology needs. Positive psychology is great. There's these people doing great things out there. They're certainly well-intentioned. But I think what they need, what people in that area need, is a bigger framework, is a framework that kind of says, let's not just what makes people happier. Let's not just do research on that or with that particular approach. Let's step back and think about what happiness is from an evolutionary perspective. Let's think about what all the emotions are from an evolutionary perspective. And that can help lead to better science into the science of happiness and the science of all the emotions and all the goals of positive psychology. So this book that Nicole and I wrote, Positive Psychology, under Darwin's Guide to Living a Richer Life, was really with this in mind of how can we advance the goals of positive psychology to help people live more positive lives at the individual and community levels, but by using Darwin's powerful framework so that we can add to the conversation and to the literature in that particular field. So that was basically the idea.
Great. And look, I want to return to the negative emotions a little bit later, because I think that's something worth focusing on and emphasizing a little bit more than you have already, just as far as what's missing from the positive psychology conversation is concerned. But it always struck me that, just as something you said, basically just restating something you said, it always struck me that conventional positive psychologists, when it came to happiness, started from the framing of that we should aspire to be happy, rather than why can we be happy among all the various emotions we could feel. So they start with that without actually ever proceeding to explain the why that comes before the that. And I think that's a hugely missing piece of the puzzle, which the Evo Psych perspective really does help fill in some of that gap. And so, I mean, the best way to fill in those gaps is to do the research, right? So we'll talk about some of your ongoing and your future positive evolutionary psychology research shortly. You've already alluded to some of it, I think. But first, let's talk about some of the extant work that's already there in the literature. I mean, I can't recall if the term positive evolutionary psychology actually originated with you, but presumably there's going to be existing supportive research that predates the coinage of the term itself in any case. So could you walk us through the history of positive Evo Psych research up to this point? And perhaps as a psych professor of such prolific publication pedigree, what you consider to be the most instructive, I guess, gold standard research findings in the space, just in terms of sheer methodological rigor and robustness of findings. What research at the moment that's already out there really makes the best case for positive evolutionary psychology?
Sure. Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think in answering that, I think I'll step back by saying that one of the things about evolutionary psychology is that a lot of people who don't know much about it tend to know some of what I'll call, quote, the sexier findings in evolutionary psychology. And I mean that half literally and half not. Because evolutionary psychology focuses largely on things that facilitate reproductive success, a good proportion of the research tends to be on what we'll call mating issues or relationship kinds of issues. And so there's stuff about infidelity, there's stuff about sexuality from an evolutionary perspective. What's interesting is that stuff is so prolific. And I'm going to say people like David Buss in particular, some of his disciples like Todd Shackelford, Dave Schmidt, Sarah Hill, a lot of these people who came from the University of Texas working with David are, huge into studying mating from an evolutionary perspective. And they find all kinds of things, and it's fascinating. But because that stuff is so prolific, there are a lot of people out there who think that the evolutionary psychology of mating and evolutionary psychology writ large are one and the same. And they're not. Mating is a big part of evolutionary psychology, but it's hardly the entirety of the pie. It's a slice. It's a slice of the pie. When you get into the idea of positive evolutionary psychology, I'd say there's a lot of other spheres within evolutionary psychology that really set the stage for this. A lot of it was worked on by David Sloan Wilson. David Sloan Wilson is a renowned evolutionary biologist who studies human behavior at Binghamton University. He came up with all kinds of ideas, understanding the nature of altruism and conditions under which people help other people. And a lot of people have studied altruism from an evolutionary perspective. Probably that research, generally speaking, set the stage very much for the idea of positive evolutionary psychology. I like to think of David's stuff as particularly relevant because he focuses very much on people working together toward common goals and how we can understand how we can cultivate that and what are the evolutionary roots of that kind of thing. So one example, he wrote this famous book called Darwin's Cathedral, which is all about understanding religion from an evolutionary perspective. Usually when people think about religion and evolution, they think of these famous, conflicts that go back, I'd say, over a century now. But what David has done is taken all the research on altruism and pro-social behavior and community building from an evolutionary perspective and applied it to understanding why religion exists and what is the function of religion. And that research has just been absolutely fascinating. And what I also like about it is that it is relatively conciliatory. So if you talk to someone who's very deeply religious and you start saying, that you're totally wrong about all your ideas, you're not really going to get very far in a conversation. But if you say, I actually study a field where we can see a lot of benefits to your religious practices and we can understand them from this deeper level, people are much, much more willing to sort of listen and engage in the conversation. So a lot of the work that David has done has shown that religion seem to have come about because it has the effect of cultivating other-oriented behavior. And humans for a very long time have collaborated and worked in groups. And one of the things that I find fascinating, one very significant finding in all this, is the fact that ancestrally modern humans, going back about 40, 50,000 years ago, that coexisted alongside Neanderthals, there were some similarities and there were some differences. And one of the big similarities was we both had big brains. And in fact, Neanderthals, on average, proportionate to body size, had larger brains than ancestrally modern humans, which a lot of people don't know. We don't know if that means they were smarter than we are or not, but it's certainly intriguing to think about. But one thing that they did not do was they did not cross over what David Wilson calls the Great Evolutionary Divide. When you find fossilized remains of Neanderthals, you tend to see kin. You tend to see small groups, maybe about between 9 to 12 people buried together. They did have burial rituals. There seems to be all kinds of evidence for that. And the DNA test suggests that this is a family. These people are related to each other. At about the same time, also going back 40, 50,000 years, you tend to see data showing that ancestrally modern humans were already in groups of about 100 to 150 and included essentially two kinds of people. Your clan would have included kin and extended kin, but also non-kin that people had long-standing relationships with. And that ability to form coalitions with non-kin is unique. It seemed like it was unique in the hominid experience. And so the particular kind of primate that we are going back between 3 and 4 million years ago, that tendency to form coalitions of individuals that cut across kin lines, huge, absolutely huge. And with that, we're able to put a man on the moon. We're able to make symphonies. We're able to create universities. We're able to do all kinds of things. And religion, according to David, and there's a lot of research suggesting it, religion was kind of a catalyst for that, because a core idea that cuts across all religions is there's policies and rules and ideas and customs that seem to try to inhibit selfish behaviors and facilitate other-oriented behaviors. And in fact, one thing that I've written about, I call it the fundamental human conflict, which is this conflict that we have, the fact that like any organism, we're in it for ourselves in a lot of ways. We need to eat, we need to sleep, we need to survive. But unlike a lot of other organisms, we have this groupish thing going on. And humans have had connections, social connections to others in small groups that cut across kin lines for a very long time. And what religion seems to do is it kind of says, subdue your selfish nature and enhance your other-oriented nature. And that conflict can sort of be thought of as a fundamental human conflict. But it's really intriguing to think about. And we can think about human groups in general from that particular perspective. So while there's a lot of exploitation within groups and not everything within a human group is always peaches and cream, people can do a lot of great things working together. And there's a lot of great benefits to the community and to individuals by effectively collaborating together. And a lot of David Wilson's research and other people studying altruism and group behavior from an evolutionary perspective really, I would say, set the stage in my mind for what we're now calling positive evolutionary psychology.
All right. And this is a nice segue through to you're just talking about working together in groups and the necessity of doing that and the bonding and affiliation and all that comes along with something like a church group or some other place of worship, which does bring people together in this way that they're not altogether apt to do or inclined to do in the modern world we live in now. I think this segues us into the topic of mismatch more broadly. Now, in my experience, as someone who did his PhD at a very conventionally positive psychology tradition school in a very positive psychology tradition leaning subdiscipline, namely organizational behavior, but who's now working primarily as a coach who employs what is effectively a positive evolutionary psychology approach to executive coaching. For me, the aspect of evolutionary psychology that makes the clearest sense to the layperson, to one of my coaching clients say, but which I never heard a single peep about at grad school, is evolutionary mismatch. Now, we don't need to relitigate the working definition of evolutionary mismatch here. I've spoken about it on this podcast a few times now. So we don't need to go through that again in detail necessarily, but suffice to say, the loud part being said quietly here, in my view, is that all the excesses of modern life, social media, cheap, crappy, mass industrialized food production, go back to something you just said, sort of, societies of large interconnected webs of people that are atomized and isolated from each other and apathetic, rather than small but close-knit groups, clans, almost quasi-clans of loving, caring, deeply invested people. I mean, what else? Incentivizing people to lead a sedentary lifestyle that greatly predicts early onset dementia, while at the same time bombarding them with chronic stress that also greatly predicts early onset dementia. So much about, I guess what you'd call like the inexorable march of civilization just can't be good for us. And at a species level, this can't be good for our minds. And I think that lay people intuitively get just how crucial this idea kind of obviously is, in this kind of overstated, overused, kind of cliched sort of way that we've removed ourselves from a state of nature. I think that lay people get how crucial this idea is in a way that's often or always overlooked among scholars in conventional positive psychology conversations. So what do you think the evolutionary mismatch framing adds to this conversation? And what are some of the ways that a positive evolutionary psychology approach can help us be mindful of where these various and seemingly multiple mismatches in modern life might lead us astray?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And I think you're right. I think one of the other very critical ways that evolutionary psychology bears on positive psychology is found in evolutionary mismatch, which in short simply speaks to situations where an organism's current environment is in important ways mismatched from the ancestral conditions that surrounded the evolution of that organism. Under ancestral conditions, we had small scale societies. We didn't know strangers. We saw the same individuals, half of whom we were related to, day in and day out. And in a condition like that, the whole game is different. And if you live in New York City and you're seeing a different 10,000 people every single day, you don't have a lot of motivation to go out of your way to be super kind to those people because you're never going to see them again. Under ancestral conditions, small scale living was the only game in town. And that's because our ancestors were nomads, and nomadic groups cannot be too large because for practical reasons, you simply can't take 10,000 people and every 3 weeks move them over the mountains over here and then over here and over here, sometimes walking 20 miles a day with every single thing that you own. There were real practical constraints. So group size was smaller. The food was very different. There was, up until the advent of, quote, civilization, the only food that existed before about 10,000 years ago was natural food. And I always tell people, like, one example is, like I love grapes. And if you think about what a grape is, like nowadays, that's cultivated, it's been, really bred to be very sweet. It probably, if you get a thing of grapes from your grocery store for $4 right now, you're probably eating something that would have been the sweetest and best thing that any human had ever eaten before 10,000 years ago. Now, compare that with today. If you ever throw a birthday party for a kid and you put out the cookies and the cupcakes and the cake, and then usually mom will put out the grapes or some kind of fruit next to it, at the end of the party, guess what you're cleaning up? And guess what there's left over? It's always the fruit. The fruit is always left over. And that's because due to evolutionary mismatch and technological advances in the food industry, we've been able to hijack the human taste buds and taste preferences and make things like chocolate chip cookies and cupcakes and buttercream and so forth. And the people making these things don't have an education in evolutionary mismatch or evolutionary reasoning. So they don't have this understanding of, wow, this might taste really good, so it might have short-term fiscal benefits for my company, but there could be very adverse long-term health consequences down the road, and we can understand that because our bodies didn't evolve to have those kinds of foods. And this same reasoning goes with so many things. cell phone technology, social media technology. Yeah, it's great that I can answer any question that my mind might possibly have at any time, anywhere, and that all of us can. That's a wonderful advance in technology. But on the other hand, the amount of problems associated with communication that is anonymous, that is not in person, is dramatic. There's a set of findings that I talked to my students about recently, which is between about the years of 2009 and 2019, you see this huge increase in three things that are totally, totally interrelated. One of them is you see a huge increase in adolescents using social media, not surprising. Another one is that you tend to see this huge increase in cyberbullying. Goes hand in hand with social media use. And another thing, and the graphs are just like right on top of each other, another thing that you tend to see is mental health problems in adolescents and young adults follows that same exact trend. So we have these technologies, and the technologies like seem wonderful in a short-term kind of immediate sense, but it's the evolutionary perspective that forces us to step back and to think about, is this really good for us? Is communicating with people that we don't know regularly normal and healthy and good for us? The way that you treat your grandmother in a face-to-face conversation is very different than how you treat someone who's on customer service and is obviously halfway across the world, and you're already mad because you're calling customer service because you have a problem in the first place. And so we didn't really evolve to have these kinds of interactions that were with people that we don't know, when it was anonymous, and we'll never see these same people again. Humans didn't evolve under those conditions. There are so many ways that the modern world is mismatched from ancestral conditions. And a very good working hypothesis, when we see a problem, especially like a societal problem, sometimes it's really helpful just to say, well, how different is this from how people in nomadic groups do it? And how different is it from how our ancestors likely did these things thousands of years ago, like education, formal education. There's a lot of kids who have problems with it. A lot of kids don't want to go to school. Kids find it anxiety inducing. Every year they get thrown in with a whole new group of other kids, and we just tell them, "Oh, that's just how it is. You just gotta do it." Well, okay, but we didn't really evolve to have education be like that whatsoever. So when you see a kid struggling, maybe it's not the kid's fault. Maybe it's the system's fault. And maybe the people who developed the system had no understanding of the importance of what our ancestral conditions were like. And so to make positive change in these kinds of things, which is a core goal of positive evolutionary psychology, I think we really need to understand what the human mind evolved to be like and what the conditions were that surrounded our evolutionary history.
Absolutely. And look, I think that this segues perfectly into the next topic I wanted to bring up, which is about resilience, because I think every one of these evolutionary mismatches is so fraught with ways that that our resilience can be broken down. I think you look at the research in fields like biological psychiatry and stuff now about the relationship between eating modern processed food and your likelihood of developing, things like early onset dementia, Alzheimer's disease, but also depression and anxiety. There's just got to be a simple rule in there, rule of thumb that people have got to understand in there, that your brain did not evolve, and by association, your mind did not evolve to be fueled by this kind of food, which would, nothing even remotely approximating it would have been available in ancestral conditions. I mean, you spoke about grapes before. I mean, yes, the grapes are the last thing to get left behind at the kid's birthday party when cookies and cupcakes and stuff are around. But even still, the grapes that we eat today are so far removed through, many successive generations of interbreeding and horticultural tricks of the trade and so forth, that they do not resemble the grapes that would have been eaten in ancestral times. And so even then, even fruits and vegetables that are ostensibly healthy and good for us, even the variants that we eat today are likely not matched to the nutritional profile that we would have had in ancestral humanity. And I mean, I'm speculating a bit here, but I suspect there is some connection there to sort of a lot of the mental health malaise that we're experiencing in modern life, which increasingly is being shown to have some connection to either poor nutrition or malnutrition. So I think the evolutionary framing, and again, for me, like in my experience, lay people get this. Lay people intuitively get this idea that it's like, okay, if you're eating nothing but Dunkin' Donuts every day, it's not just that you're going to put on weight and you're going to get out of shape. You can't outthink a bad diet in the way that you might be able to out exercise a bad diet, right? So you might be able to eat Dunkin' Donuts all day and then spend 6 hours on the treadmill and not have you put weight on. But that's not going to do anything about the effects it has on your brain. And I mean, we could run that same tape through all these different kinds of evolutionary mismatches, and we'd arrive at much the same conclusion, that there's something about how far removed we are in modern life from where we were that just simply can't be good for our brains. And I think this actually segues into this topic of resilience, which you had a whole chapter on in the book. This idea that building resilience is actually an evolved psychological adaptation. And so we typically think of, I mean, those of us who are familiar with the literature anyway, we tend to think of resilience as this idea about the ability to mentally cope with challenges and adapt to uncertainty and adversity and so forth. And that necessarily involves some amount of having to deal with negativity. So let's return to the negative emotions, which you spoke about earlier, because I think one of the things that gets lost in translation in the positive psychology conversation is the notion that our negative emotions have real utility, at least if we try and use them judiciously. I don't think any serious psychologists these days that I'm aware of, at least, would argue that negative emotions have no place. But I've kind of heard variations on the idea that they are always just kind of a bad starting place when it comes to human growth and generativity, kind of by definition, right? That if you start from a place of negative emotions, you'll never aspire towards the kind of positivity you should be aspiring towards, or that negative emotions are just inherently inimical to building resilience altogether. So what role, in your view, do the negative emotions play in healthy, everyday human psychological functioning, and perhaps specifically with regard to our ability to become more resilient? And do you think, maybe on top of that, do you think that role that role that your negative emotions play, do you think it's being earnestly addressed in psychology more generally and among the positive psychology peeps in particular?
Well, there's a lot to it, what you're asking, and I think it's a super interesting point and interesting question, because the emotions, so much of positive psychology is about emotions. One of the main journals there is the Journal of Happiness Studies, as an example. And like you're saying, Gareth, a lot of this research starts with happiness as the first concept, and then how do we facilitate that, as opposed to putting a bigger sort of framework on it. Resilience is critical, and people don't develop resilience by simply being sheltered, by simply being given happy situations all the time. To develop calluses on your hands and on your feet, you need to grab that pull-up bar and, pick up that baseball bat or whatever you're doing, or, go running, or whatever the things are that ultimately are going to put calluses on your body. You kind of have to work for it, and then that stuff's there to protect you. So then that way I have these calluses on my hand here. And then when I grab something at a future point, if I'm doing some work, I'm not going to get a bunch of blisters. I'm not going to be bleeding. I'm going to be better off because I have these calluses. And resilience is really quite similar. There's a fine balance. I mean, experiencing overwhelming or abnormal doses of negative emotional experiences is famously not good for people. So this is hardly the advice hardly ends up being, have a lot of bad stuff happen or feel a lot of bad things. But people need to experience negative experiences to learn from them, to know that they exist, to understand them, to develop the ability to deal with them in the future. In academia, so I've been in academia for my entire adult life. And the number of rejections, I'm great on Facebook. I'm great at putting my successes up on Facebook, like a lot of us are. But what I don't put up is, I might say, oh, here's an article that we just got published. Isn't this great? And what I don't put up is it was rejected by 4 journals before this, or I won this award, isn't this great? But I was rejected for this other award, or I had this great outcome with this one. I was invited to give a talk at this one school, but I asked to give a talk at another school 10 years ago, and I'm still waiting for the phone call back. University of Florida, just putting that out there. A wonderful school, by the way. But failure, and we write about this. Nicole actually took the lead on that chapter, and I've gotten a lot of good feedback on that particular chapter on resilience. Failure is necessary for success. And when you look at the people who are the most successful people in your world, they are the people who've taken risks. They are the people that have been proactive. And they are people who have probably more failures than successes to their experience. And it's a matter of being able to be resilient. When you run into a failure, a lot of people are like, all right, I'm done. There's this one paper that I worked with a bunch of students on years ago. And I thought it was a better than average paper. It was really interesting data. And I'll never forget, there was a student, very, very bright student, very hardworking, super diligent, and worked really hard. And we submitted it to the top journal, which is a typical kind of thing in academia. You sort of start at the top journals and then sort of work down a little bit if you get rejected. And I remember the student really was just destroyed by the negative feedback in the rejection letter from the top journal, and showed it to me, shared it with me. And I was like, oh, that's par. That's exactly par. But I remember the student said she was very polite about it, but she said, I don't really, you can do whatever you want with this. I don't really want to experience this again. And I think there's a lot of people who, we try to avoid negative affective situations. That's part of our evolutionary design. But when it becomes too much, it somehow can get in our own way of actually trying things and moving forward and doing things. So I'd say that there's a real fine line regarding how much negativity can we handle. But when you're shooting for zero negativity, you're going to have a hard time building resilience. You're going to have a hard time dealing with failure in the future. And you're going to ultimately have a hard time finding happiness because you're not going to have successes, because you're not going to try, because your fears about failing might inhibit yourself. And so I think that in working with young people, encouraging them to give it a try and to stand up after failure, I think is an absolutely critical part of the broader human experience, and something that again, I think positive evolutionary psychology can help us understand that and can help provide something of a roadmap for how to do that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think just maybe as a good place to start winding things down here, I mean, maybe you could give us a sense of what the landscape to come is looking like in terms of the research in positive evolutionary psychology, and what kind of work is being done now in terms of research and other initiatives and projects. What are some of the things that yourself and your grad students and your postdocs and other folks are going to be working on in times to come, such that the already strong case that you're able to make for the value of positive evolutionary psychology, how can you and your students and your collaborators, how can you continue to empirically make that more robust so it continues to add the value to positive psychology that you have already shown that it can add and can hopefully add more of in the future?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question, Gareth. I think that we need to start doing research or continue doing research that is evolutionarily informed, but that has some kind of obvious positive messages. Now, I know that as scientists, it's important to sort of be neutral toward data, and the phrase "let the data speak" is, very standard, and I do agree with that. But from an optics perspective, from a PR perspective, I think that honestly, from a practical perspective, we got to think about that too. If we just let evolutionary psychology run loose without thinking about where this fits within our broader culture, without thinking where it fits in academia writ large, we may end up doing a disservice to the future of evolutionary psychology. So, positive evolutionary psychology, while it is basic evolutionary psychological science, it also does have a little bit of an applied agenda of let's ask and answer questions that can help make for people to experience better lives. One example that we've done in our research team, and this is maybe for going back over 5 years now, is we're doing research that is seeking to understand what are the consequences of having a mind evolved for small scale living in a large scale social context. And are there things that we run into that are unpleasant that we can that we can only understand by applying an evolutionary perspective? And maybe this can give us guidance into what we might be able to do differently or do better. So I'll give an example. Several years ago, my team published research on the evolutionary psychology of estrangements. Estrangements are like relationships that are just totally severed. We titled the article, "You're Dead to Me," just to give an example of what that concept is in simple terms. And if you think about under ancestral conditions, when people were living in small scale societies of about 100 to 150 people, seeing the same people inside and out every single day, an estrangement was going to be problematic, because if I'm estranged from this guy, and this guy has 20 family members in the clan, and we have 10 shared friends, and there's a lot of gossip that goes on because all the research on gossip shows that it's ubiquitous across human groups, that estrangement could be problematic for me. Now let's double it or triple it or quadruple it. If we have 4 estrangements in a group of about 100 people, and there's all those connections that other people have, that could really, really be super problematic and even dangerous at some point, and even things like threats of ostracism or being fully disconnected from others could be very palpable and real threats. So we did a study that essentially wanted to look at what are the psychological and social correlates of number of estrangements, with the basic prediction that if you're estranged from a lot of people, that's going to correspond to all kinds of negative outcomes, which is exactly what we found. And it's funny because a lot of therapists and people who go to therapy will corroborate this. Therapists talk about cutting toxic people out of your life. I'm not going to say that that's a bad idea, and there certainly are conditions under which that sort of has to happen. But we got to be careful, because people in our research who report a higher number of estrangements, a higher number of people who are dead to them in the world, tend to score higher on depression. They have anxious attachment styles, emotional instability. They report lower social support from others. They report lower well-being in life in an overall sense. There's a whole broad array of adverse consequences that seem to go with estrangements. The average in that study, by the way, was 4. So the average number of estrangements that an American college student has. Now, this was about 6 years ago when we collected those data. Fast forward, we have a publication coming out. It'll be out in the next week or two on ghosting. And so with social media, people can ghost each other. And when you ghost each other, it's kind of like an almost too easy way to estrange someone. And so this is a case, I think, where our social media is getting in the way of our mental health. When we did the same study conceptually about estrangements, except we used social media-based ghosting, as opposed to just traditional old, I'm not talking to you again, I'm not going to look at you at the grocery store kind of thing. And what we found was it was about double. So when we look at estrangements now, especially when framed as people you've ghosted or have ghosted you, people on average come up with about 8. So I kind of interpret that as social media, this mismatched technology, is kind of doubling, in a sense, this social outcome that we know to be adverse, that from an evolutionary perspective would have been absolutely disastrous. And it's not going away. It's really not going away. So I think that, that's some of the research that my team and I are doing. We're doing a whole bunch of research. It's really just looking at like social interactions, thinking about it from an evolutionary perspective, thinking about what would these interactions would have led to under ancestral conditions. And maybe that's why a lot of the social interactions that we have now, even though we're in large scale situations, maybe that's the reason that people who have a lot of estrangements under modern conditions, if you have a lot of estrangements, that could be okay because you live maybe in New York City and there's 8 million people and you could have a lot of potential friends and connections. But those estrangements still hurt because we have minds that were not evolved for New York City in 2022. We have minds evolved for the African savanna in small nomadic groups from thousands of generations ago. And that whole idea of positive evolutionary psychology is just really brings things back to that point with the hope that at some point we can use that approach to inform policy, at corporations, maybe at the government level, maybe in terms of how we shape education. Once we start thinking this way, it opens our eyes to understanding so many of the problems that we have that we don't even realize we have sometimes.
Yeah, and look, this to me is just the center of the bullseye for this whole initiative and this whole subdiscipline is just its applied value. I mean, someone who works with business executives, teaches at a business school, my eyes always light up when I just think about just how many aspects of the business world alone this could be applied to. And on top of that, not for nothing, a lot of the positive psychology literature, I think the average business person is applied to is what I would sort of derisively, not a term that's original to me, but what I've heard derisively call an airport book. So it's the very sort of clean and conventional positive psychology, the kind that proceeds from that assumption of that you should be happy without ever probing why, and not the kind of literature that's going to probe deep enough on things like how social estrangement is a bad thing, but it's something that you're likely to experience more of in a more amplified way when it comes to something like being ghosted on social media because of the modern world we live in now. I just think, again, that so many lay people, the basic ideas of evolutionary psychology land with them in a way for which I guess maybe they just don't for various scholastic reasons among different psychology scholars. But yeah, I just think that the applied value of this framework has such tremendous upside and particularly for the business world. So, I read your book not long after it came out and loved it. I've tried to spread the gospel as much as I can, but I'm kind of but one man. So I really do hope that this book and your work finds its way into the hands of more people and not just the business world, but society more broadly, because I think there is such tremendous upside to this kind of marriage of two disciplines that you've been able to put together using the insights from Evo Psych to inform this bigger positive psychology movement. And I just think there's so much good that can come from this, especially in an applied sense. I mean, also, the scholarly work behind the scenes is still always got to be done, but I think just the applied upside of this is virtually unlimited. So, Glenn, I just want to thank you for, taking one for the team here, I guess, and spearheading this initiative, you and your collaborators who have done all this work and who are trying to advance positive evolutionary psychology on this upward trajectory. I wish you every success with continuing to cash out this framework in terms of your upcoming research, and just want to wish you all the best, with your continued work up there at New Paltz and all the great work you're doing in teaching, research, lab work. NEEPS, all the other initiatives you're involved in. You're a busy, busy man. And so I tremendously appreciate you just making all the time you've made to speak with me today.
Well, Gareth, I got to say, I always enjoy talking to you. I really appreciated having this conversation. And one final note from my end, I love the Led Zeppelin shirt.
Oh, well, I love the fact that you play in a punk rock band that I only just found out about recently. So maybe we could set up a conversation about music for a future conversation.
That sounds great to me.
Wonderful, Glenn. Well, all the best. Always great talking to you as well. Great to see you. Do take good care of yourself. And we will hopefully cross paths again very, very soon.
Absolutely. That sounds great. Thanks so much, Gareth.
Wonderful. Cheers, Glenn. Take care.
And they got me thinking.